Oh, just give me one hot second. My ears, these earrings. Goodness gracious. Oh, oh, oh. Okay. All right. I'm going to come up in five. Oh, just going to hurt. Four, three. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Let's talk about the Trump Zelensky European Leader Summit. And we can talk about President Putin last week. What is happening, everybody? What is happening? How did we get here, and where do we go from here? Let's talk about that here on the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Please meet me on Blue Sky, santitajackson.bsky.social, santitajackson.bsky.social. And everybody, like and share the show. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. I need your help in the algorithm. Twitter or X at SantitaJ, and on YouTube, the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel, where some of you are coming now. So come on in, come on in. And then the Santita Jackson and Friends page, Santita Jackson and Friends. That's the only Facebook page where I can accept friends. So let's get to it. I've been talking with this brilliant young man for several years now, and it is always a pleasure to have him here, and an honor, in fact, a great freedom fighter. That's a great compliment in my family. Bryce Green, the Green BJ. That's
Much
right.
appreciated, Santita.
Oh, fairness and accuracy in reporting is how I first met you. And I first met you talking about this Ukraine conflict. Ukraine, Russia, or is it the United States, Russia? What's the best way to characterize it? Well, here we are years later, hundreds of thousands of people dead later. We've seen a lot, and yet many of us are disoriented. We don't know where we are. We don't even know why we're here. And so we need to talk with you about that. Because indeed, the United Nations, you went there to speak on this issue. Because we need some clarity. We need to understand what this is about. Will there be a breakthrough today? Will there, what will be a just end for all of this? So, everybody, please like and share, like and share, like and share. Many of us could not find Ukraine on a map. And yet, we have given them untold sums of money that could be used in the United States. And yet, interestingly enough, Bryce Green, a lot of people, and they don't talk about this, which is interesting, a lot of people who are supportive of this conflict are of Ukrainian extraction, for example. Very quietly in Chicago, as we have made a big fuss about the South and Central Americans who've been resettled in Chicago and throughout the country. 38,000 Ukrainians were settled in Chicago with barely a peep. Did you know that, Bryce Green?
I didn't know that, but I had visited the Ukrainian village in Chicago before.
No, they were
Nice little
settled
area.
as a direct result of this. But our governor's family is from Ukraine.
Hmm.
Tony Blinken's family, our former Secretary of State, from the Ukraine. Victoria Nuland, her family's from Ukraine. Many people who are shaping this policy, they don't tell us this, they are actual Ukrainian Americans. So it's not as if these are people who do not have an interest in Ukraine. And it's not that I don't wish people well everywhere, Bryce Green, but a lot of these people have a familial tie and maybe a familial axe to grind. I don't know. I do know it's costing us a lot of money, and it's cost a lot of people a lot of lives. Ukrainians have not had an election. They don't have freedom of speech. We know when this first happened, when Africans tried to leave, they could not leave. And it left a lot of black people all over the world a little warm about this. So I need you to take us. Well, let's start here. Let's start here. Maybe we can work our way back. What do you think of this meeting today? Is it disconnected from the Trump Putin meeting in Alaska just a few days ago? And why are the European leaders here? Kind of help us to see what we're looking at.
Well, to help us really understand how to contextualize these recent meetings, these recent talks, all these statements going back from either side, I think we need to look back at what this conflict is and how it started and why it continues to persist. I think the easiest starting point, of course, is some people like to start at February 22nd, 2022, when Russia formally invaded Ukraine. They announced their special military operation. But people who have been looking at this conflict understand that this was merely an escalation of an ongoing conflict that had been simmering since 2014-15. And that conflict has its root in the events of Maidan in February 2014, when elements backed by the U.S. and the U.S. itself helped overthrow the uh, more moderate Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych in favor of installing a government that was favorable to some of the far right elements and that was more favorable to Western investors. And this angered a large chunk of the country, and that started the Civil War period all the way back in 2014. And there were agreements to maybe mitigate that civil war, come to some sort of arrangement. But these agreements were never seriously pursued by the West and by Ukraine. And the Minsk Accords, which was the name of the first agreement that they came to, it involved everyone stopping the fighting. It involved new elections. It involved a referenda on the degree of independence in these eastern parts of Ukraine that were closer to Russia. This was part of the main settlement to this whole thing, but the Ukrainians never really adhered to it. In fact, they passed constitutional amendments actually preventing this agreement from being adhered to. Well, just showing just how little they were being pressured to pursue peace. And so this was a simmering civil war for 8 years until 2022. And in the run up to 2022, the Russians had been trying to find some sort of real peaceful solution. Putin had been asking to meet with Western leaders to talk about renewing the Minsk Accords. He had been meeting with President Biden, or at least talking or sending signals to President Biden about the need to come to some sort of arrangement. Because one of the reasons that Russia is so concerned about Ukraine being in the Western orbit is that if Ukraine is in NATO, well, then that means that Russia has on its near border a hostile military alliance. And with NATO comes military exercises, which are always opportunities for sabotage or infiltration or other skullduggery. There's also the question of weapons and military bases and nukes or missiles wherever. If Ukraine is in NATO, uh, well, if missiles are stationed right on Russia's border, that really invalidates their ability to react to any sort of strike on their territory. And there's not enough time. The distance is entirely too short. So Russia brought these concerns to the West, and the West essentially said that we don't care about what your concerns are. We don't care about your ability to feel safe. And in fact, this was keeping in line with Western plans that they had written out on paper to actually provoke Russia into invading Ukraine. Now, this was part of a Rand Corporation document back in 2019, where they just said if we continue to grow closer to Ukraine, if we give them more weapons, Russia might invade. This would be a good outcome. And so, in keeping with that, in early 2022, they did not negotiate to any serious extent, and then Russia decided to invade. Now, shortly after that, the Russians and Ukrainians came to the table. This was in Istanbul in April of 2022. Now, in Istanbul, the Ukrainians and Russians signed a draft agreement that actually addressed many of the core concerns on both sides. It assured that Ukraine would remain neutral and not in NATO. It assured that the territory of Crimea would be discussed in a future arrangement. They also included that Ukraine would get security guarantees from the United States, Russia, and all of its neighbors and European powers, and Ukrainians and Russians agreed to this. And this was a pretty high point for the negotiators. However, later on, we've received plenty of information backing this up. The U.S. and the U.K. intervened to tell Ukraine that no, we don't want you to make a peace agreement. We want you to keep fighting because our goal isn't to preserve Ukrainian lives. It's to weaken Russia. It's to ensure that Russia is getting bogged down in a foreign war, a quagmire, so that they can, bleed their coffers, make their economy suffer, and gain the geopolitical edge. And so, uh, this was the U.S.'s position. Don't negotiate. And so the negotiations ended. The war continued, and throughout this entire period, Western press was, pretty triumphant, saying that Ukraine is going to win. That well, just after this other counteroffensive, uh, Ukraine might be able to defeat Russia. This was always a fantasy, just on pure industrial grounds. Ukraine and even NATO writ large, which is funding Ukraine, doesn't have the ability to compete with Russian industrial capacity. And so, for the last 3, 4 years, well, I guess it's been 3 years, now the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian society has been slowly bleeding. Hundreds of thousands of people are, being killed. The Ukrainians have implemented different versions of martial law. President Zelensky has consolidated a lot of his power. Banned oppositional media, banned opposition parties, and recently attempted to disband the independence of one of their top anti-corruption agencies. All at the same time, in the West, we're always talking about, well, we're doing this for Ukrainian democracy. Meanwhile, we're destroying it, and as I mentioned, we destroyed the prospects for peace. Now, this was largely under Biden during this war period. However, yeah. The Trump ran on a campaign of ending the Ukraine war and actually sitting down and doing peace negotiations, which was a very positive development. He said that he could do it in 24 hours. Well, he came into power, and for the most part, it seems that his plan isn't to actually end the war and address its root causes. It's to offload a lot of the money and offload a lot of the fighting onto the Europeans. And the Europeans themselves, they've been saying for a long time, we still want this war to continue. We believe that Russia is a threat, but we like it when U.S. pays the bills. This seems to be the big thing that sparked a change in the Trump administration. But Trump is a very mercurial figure and changes his mind quite often, and so, uh, this deal or this meeting with Putin actually came as a pretty good opportunity for some positives. Uh, and in the press before this meeting, we started seeing things like, well, Ukrainians are considering land swaps. Ukrainians are, ready to make a deal. All of this would, of course, be essential if there was to be a peace negotiation, right? They'd have to give up land. I mean, if you provoke a war and then you reject a peace settlement, then the peace settlement is only going to get harsher as the war drags on and your position has not improved. And so they seem to be willing to do that. That was this Trump Putin Alaska summit. Trump met Trump met Putin, and Putin laid out what his demands are, and they really haven't changed in the last year and a half, right? We keep these annexed territories. We keep Crimea. Ukraine is neutral, and we stop the war, and that's what we want. Ukraine gets security guarantees so that they're not vulnerable to a future invasion. They also can't have a big military to threaten us, and we'll pull back on the war. This was the deal offered in 2000 or in June of 2024, and this was essentially the deal that was reiterated between Trump and Putin at this summit. It's an open question to what extent Trump or the people around him are willing to put pressure on Zelensky and the Ukrainians to actually accept this deal. But this seems to be a very good start to something. If Trump continues to believe in this plan of shifting the burden to Europe, then this might not actually address the underlying issues of the conflict, but instead could end up being a just a blip in a prolonged and protracted destruction of Ukraine, which would
Oh,
be a horrible tragedy.
but why are we there? I know that sounds like a very, very small question, but I don't think it is. Many of us cannot find Ukraine on a map, Bryce. And in 2022, or really for years, uh, it seems like President Biden oversaw Ukraine, and of course uh, you had a democratically elected head of state, and we pushed to overthrow that government, and we did. Why? What are we doing over there? And then you have a lot of prominent Americans who are on the boards um, of their oil and gas companies.
Right.
What is it about you? There's the movie. There's something about Mary. Well, there's something about Ukraine. What is it?
So there are a number of concerns that animate the U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine. Some of them corporate, some of them geostrategic, both of them intertwined. The main one I think is geostrategic. Russia has been a geopolitical adversary of the United States for well over a century. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States saw an opportunity to expand its influence closer and closer to a weakened Russia. Russia has objected to that for decades, saying that they don't want NATO to encroach upon their borders, but the U.S. believes that they have the right to, and so they try to do it. Um, i Russia is a threat to the U.S. because it sits at the opposite end of this global struggle of polarity that's playing out right now. On one end, you have the West, the United States, Europe, Australia, South Korea, Japan can be added into that as well, who are the masters of the universe, so to speak. They're capitalist fueled empires dedicated to controlling all the world. There are resistance to that. China, Russia, the BRICS bloc is playing a central role in coalescing some of this resistance, in having what's called a multipolar world, a world where the U.S. isn't the top dog and can't decide who lives and who dies all around the world. This is very appealing to Russia and China, who have their own domestic and foreign ambitions and plans for the future. And so, one of the ways that the U.S. is responding to this is by putting pressure on Russia and China and by trying to get them to expend a lot of their resources on these peripheral issues. In that Rand Corporation study I mentioned, the title of it was called Overextending and Unbalancing Russia. This was paid for by, I believe, the United States Air Force back in 2019 as a way of assessing options for the United States empire to weaken Russia. And this was a very important goal, as they explained, because Russia and China could pose a threat to U.S. global primacy. And so the ways that they outlined how to uh, uh, overextend Russia correspond to largely America's foreign policy for the last 6 years. And so the root of America's interest in Ukraine is that if it is in the Western orbit, then that can put more pressure on Russia. It can cause Russia to extend resources defending itself from a potential threat. It could cause Russia to, internal disputes over what to do about it. All sorts of reasons. But one of the core ones is that if Ukraine is in NATO specifically, if you get to station a nuclear site in Ukraine, then that is so close to Moscow that if Russia wanted to respond to a nuclear weapon attack, it wouldn't have the time to. The entire balance of power of the Cold War would be disrupted. Russia, of course, sees this, and Putin has talked about this numerous times, and has acted to try and prevent that possibility. So that's the geostrategic reason for American interest in Ukraine. But another interest is corporate. And like I said, they're linked. But more acutely, American corporations had a vested interest in getting a trade deal with Ukraine back in 2014. American and European, of course. The reason for Viktor Yanukovych's overthrow in 2014 in the Maidan coup was that he had rejected an EU deal, an EU trade deal, and that would have accompanied an IMF loan. This deal would have had all sorts of ill effects. It would have required the Ukrainian public sector to sell off some of its assets and lay off some of its workers, reduced subsidies for heating, oil, fuel. Just the austerity playbook from neoliberal institutions. The Russians offered a different package that was far less onerous on the Ukrainian people, required them to change far less of their laws, required them to, maintain their welfare state as it had been run. This isn't profitable to the United States. And so the United States helped back in the overthrow. And in the wake of that overthrow, the new government instantly they adopted this EU plan. They adopted these IMF loans. They adopted these cuts to subsidies. They adopted these cuts to public services. They adopted this cuts to public workforces. They essentially fulfilled a neoliberal dream. And in doing so, they empowered a major oligarch class, both in Ukraine, but especially on Wall Street and London, the financiers of all this. And if you look at the organizations that were funding the overthrow, that were funding the NGOs that helped build the base of support for Maidan, it's the National Endowment for Democracy, it's the Ford Foundation, it's the International Republican Institute, and these are part of a broad network of NGOs that largely get their money from corporate America. They largely get their money from either corporate America or the governments that they have bought. And so you can really trace the influence and the interests in this Ukraine business quite deeply. So these corporate and these geostrategic interests really coalesce in the think tank space, which is the space where foreign policy is generally manufactured in its fullest and most complete forms before it's then presented to Congress to then ratify. If it's presented to Congress at all, most of that happens with the executive. And so these think tanks, they've written about Ukraine for quite some time. They are the people who are shaping this policy. And if you read these think tanks, they say the same thing. Ukraine offers a challenge to U.S. Or Ukraine offers an opportunity for the U.S. to defend its primacy, to put pressure on Russia, and it's also a great opportunity for Western corporations. And they'll couch it in terms of being good for Ukraine and everything and everyone. But that's of course the neoliberal fig leaf that has been so dangerous and devastating to economies all around the world. And so Ukraine is another target and has been a victim of this global system, this global trade system that's been trying to expand both U.S. corporate power and also tacitly or implicitly expand U.S. military power.
Well, historically, hasn't Ukraine, they've moved around to different sides, just historically. They've sided with Russia, they've been with Poland, why are they, it's almost as if they've been at the center of a tug of war. Why is that? Is it because there's vast mineral wealth in the soil, vast mineral wealth in terms of their natural resources? I mean, what is it? Why? And they're called the breadbasket of the world. I mean, what is it? Why are they so central to? Why does everybody want a piece of Ukraine?
Well, it's really location, location, location. It's situated within the pathways of historically great empires, like the Russian Empire. It's the pathway through which Nazi Germany invaded the USSR in Operation Barbarossa. It's critically important because it's a crossroads of Europe, and yes, its mineral wealth and its especially grain wealth has been instrumental in especially feeding really the entire continent of Africa. And like you said, the breadbasket of Europe. And so it's always been the center of this tug of war. And this tug of war is actually really reflected, I think, in the ideologies or the opinions of the people who live in eastern Ukraine versus in western Ukraine. Go back to 2014 with the Maidan coup. Most of the support for Maidan came from western Ukraine, closer to Europe, closer to Poland, Much of the opposition and rebellion came from east, closer to Russia, more Russian speaking. And you can look at the election of Viktor Yanukovych. In the West, he was supported by small number of people. In the East, he was supported by a large number of people. And when he was overthrown, the people in the East were very upset about it, and that was what led to the Civil War in 2014. And you even see it today in public opinion about the war. The more eastern you get to Ukraine, and the closer you get to the front lines, the lower and lower the support for the war is. That's been true since February of 22. It's been true throughout the entire war. And recently, the Western Ukraine is actually catching up to Eastern Ukraine in terms of their desire for a ceasefire, for a peace deal. A poll by, I believe it was the Gallup institution, they found that 69% of Ukrainians are in favor of a deal as soon as possible, irrespective of the terms. They want a peace deal. That's up from numbers like 40% and 45% earlier in the war. Of course,
What
these numbers have to be taken with a grain of salt because they exclude areas that are completely under Russian control, like Crimea and the eastern, the Donbas republics.
how would that? How do you think, including Crimea and these Russian-controlled areas, how do you think that would change the polling?
Oh, it would be overwhelming. I'm not,
Well,
I haven't looked at the data on this, but I'd be probably well over 80%, if not 90%. I mean, there's a very small constituency who's in favor of the war, and you can easily see why. If you look at what's going on in Ukraine, you can easily see videos of young men being abducted off the streets and being thrown into vans by military recruiters because there's a conscription law and it's enforced by thugs, and they ship them to the front lines, don't give them a lot of training, and they die horrible deaths. Recently, the United Kingdom had a story where a father of two, was so convinced that his role was to defend democracy in Ukraine that he went to go fight in. He signed up to go be a volunteer, and he was dead within a month. Like in the time that he departed and the time that he shipped off, he was dead within a month. Like these are needless deaths that are happening because of this, this proxy war, and it's very easy to see why people want this to end.
do Americans, do does the American business community want this to end, or do they want this to be extended?
So they seem divided. The fact that there is a talk about peace in Ukraine indicates that there is a class of people who are interested in seeing a peace in Ukraine. However, I think more than that is the large number of supporters of the war. The defense industry, of course, they see this as a dramatic windfall because they get to keep supplying weapons. They get to keep supplying weapons that need to be replenished. There are some empire planners who are actually very hesitant to continue the war because it's such a drain on American resources. And the real thing that America should be doing is preparing for a war with China over Taiwan. And so, if they're thinking about the health of the empire writ large, they argue, some of them do, that we should be focusing on China, and this Ukraine business needs to be wound down and settled as soon as possible. And of course, the business community has there's plenty of there's talk about rebuilding Ukraine and estimates about how this will be a $1 trillion windfall to all the corporations who are going to cash in on rebuilding Ukraine, which may or may not be true. But the fact is that I think the bigger push seems to be for continuing this conflict. If Trump is now representing that counter push, I think that's positive. But what's most likely is that they're going to continue to do exactly what they've said that they're going to do: transfer this to Europe and give this and allow this conflict to continue to bleed Russia.
If this goes to Europe, where does that leave the United States?
Well, the United States actually wins in this situation as well because Europe, if they were providing the weapons for Ukraine more than the U.S. is, they'd be purchasing these weapons from largely American companies. I mean, like Europe's defense industrial base isn't anywhere near what America's is, and so if they're purchasing like Patriot missiles, other armaments and things like that, they're going to U.S. companies. They're going to Lockheed Martin. They're going to General Dynamics, and that's money that goes to the U.S. Except less of the public money is being spent on that. It's someone else's public's money. Instead of you or me or my our taxes going to buying Javelin missiles, it'll be guys in the UK. It'll be guys in Germany. It'll be guys in Belgium. It'll be guys in France who are now paying for those weapons. But the goal, of course, of bleeding Russia remains the same. So, and the U.S. gets to offload a pretty major financial burden.
What is what is the end game here? I mean, do you see a pathway for this to end, for the conflict to end? And at the end, will Ukraine be a part of Russia? Uh, will they will they be reabsorbed into Russia? Because they've gone back and forth. I mean, what do you think will happen? Or will they be a sovereign state? Whose side will they be on? Will they be in NATO? I mean, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but I'm trying to figure out just there's got to be an end point, basically,
Yes, and
and
we should be
it's
clear.
ill defined.
Right. We should be clear that there has been a way to resolve this issue since day one. It's neutrality and it's recognizing legitimate security interests. But the U.S. has rejected that. If we go back to what the negotiations were about in the run up to 2022 and the run up to February 22, they were about these things. It said if we get neutrality, if there is a real recognition that we are equals here and that you can't just stick missiles on our border and expect us to shut up, then we can have some sort of peace. That's been the case. That's been more or less the position of the Russians this entire conflict. The conditions have changed as Russia has spent more of its blood and treasure on this. They are, of course, expecting more in response, but that's the contours of that are still available. So if Trump really wants to make peace, what he'd do is he would say, Zelensky, this is happening. This peace deal is happening. You can like it or not, but this is the peace deal. Because the peace deal was the summit wasn't with Ukraine, but that's largely correct. It's U.S. generals who are deciding what Ukraine's military is doing. There's a command center in Germany where Ukrainian commanders answer to them. Ukraine gets all of its money from the U.S. Ukraine gets satellite targeting assistance from the U.S. It's an American conflict. But if Trump wanted to actually end it, he would say to Zelensky, like, yes, this is what we're doing, and this is how it's going to be, and you have to accept this. And the nationalists within your, political constituency, they have to accept it as well. That's not going to be easy, mind you. It's going to be a fight. It's going to be difficult. But again, large majorities of people in Ukraine are in supportive of a peace deal, and so all he would have to do is enforce it. Is make sure that it happened. It's not clear that what he's going to do, and if that's the case, then we're looking at a prolonged conflict. In which case, things like the complete literal disintegration of the Ukrainian state are actually firmly on the table, however crazy that might sound. Whether or not it'll be reabsorbed into Russia or whether or not it'll be spun off into its own thing, that's difficult to speculate. The eastern Ukraine Donbass area, that is going to be part of Russia, but the rest of Ukraine, I mean, Putin has been very clear that he has no interest in occupying the entire country, which seems to be what the U.S. was expecting when they got Russia to invade. Putin is only interested in solving the underlying issues. Now, I want to be clear again in saying that there's a difference between a ceasefire and a peace deal, right? A ceasefire is what some people in the U.S. have been calling for, saying we're going to cease the fire, we're going to freeze the conflict, allow Ukraine to regroup itself and gather up its strength, restock on some weapons, but then there's a peace deal, which is resolving this conflict, making it so that no one has any interest in building up weapons or continuing the fighting at a later date. Russia has been pushing for a peace deal, the West has been pushing for a ceasefire. But if we get a ceasefire, that's only pushing the can down the road. And it's something that Russia, since it's winning the war right now, has very little interest in doing.
Well, I mean, we've not heard that distinction, and certainly peace is not being pushed in corporate media, unfortunately, as people die. Um, just game this out for me. Help me to understand. Just it seems like Europe is reconfiguring itself, Bryce. I mean, because we have a new world order. I don't know if this is the one that the Europeans were counting on. I mean, I don't know if they were counting on the rise of BRICS, for example, right? Africa beginning to organize, led in many respects by a a renewed South Africa. Um, it's just South and Central America. Uh, they Maduro has been able to hold out in ways that I don't think that the West counted on. You know, Lula returned to power in Brazil. I mean, it's not the world that I think the Western European nations counted on. And so when I look at this conflict in Ukraine, I'm wondering if that's like a burr in their side to have this conflict while the rest of the world is marching on, reorganizing, I mean, around a world where the American dollar won't be the reserve currency, right? Which is going to completely reset how we live. I mean, are we really understanding that?
No, I don't. I don't think that this has been a part of the discussion at all, which is what's so dangerous. And one of the other issues that also makes this dangerous is the risk of imminent catastrophe if this thing escalates out of hand with nuclear weapons. There are so many issues that frame and define the stakes and the causes of this conflict that are just completely omitted from the Western press and from public discussion in general. And I think that this question of what this means for the broader U.S. global order are some of the more interesting ones. For example, when this war started, one of the top policy goals of the United States was to crush the Russian economy with sanctions. Biden said the rubble will be or the ruble will be rubble. They implemented all these sanctions. They froze the reserves. They started punishing corporations for doing work on with Russian corporations without special waivers. The goal was to shock the Russian economy in a way that prevented it from A, continuing its war effort, but B, continue to act as a counterbalance to the Western industrial base and allowing it to be, have its own development path and allow it to be a counterbalance to American global power. If But this was unsuccessful. Most countries in the world, the majority of the world's population, if we're going by that measure, absolutely rejected to go along with America's sanctions regime because they didn't buy the nonsense about America fighting this war for democracy or about Russia violating some norm that was universally agreed upon. No, they understood that Russia had legitimate security concerns that the U.S. had uh, uh, just overtly flouted, and they understood Russia's invasion as a natural response to that. And the U.S. campaign of bullying and coercion to get them to affect their own economies, to get to achieve American geopolitical ends, was really a raw deal.
Well,
And
hold
they
on.
decided,
Let me just jump in right here because I don't know if Americans really understand how we're perceived in the world to that point.
right,
Rice. I don't think that and we talked about this when I met you 3 years ago, when this first occurred. We said this is not going to go the way you think it is because India's not going to sign on
right.
America's side. The African nations are not going to sign on. They
Latin
really
America, they're not going
Latin
to sign
America,
on.
and they didn't. Do we really understand how we're perceived throughout the world?
So
I mean,
in the West,
help us
yeah,
to understand how we are perceived.
so in the West, there's a concept that some of the critics use. We call it the map. If you look at a map of countries that represent, the Western countries, there's the world, and there's the world according to the West. And if you take out, it, you read a headline that says the world is with Ukraine. The world is standing with the U.S.'s campaign to, attack Russia. And you look at the list of countries, it's usually the usual suspects. Usually like North America, United States, Canada. It's usually Europe, and then maybe South Korea, Japan, and Australia. Maybe them. That's considered
Vassal
the world,
states.
but that omits the entire rest of the world, which is the majority of the world's population. If we look at China, for example, largest country in the world, they weren't going along with the sanctions. If we look at India, world's second largest country, actually, I think India is bigger than China
It's
now. I'm not.
more populous. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, either way, like the two largest countries in the world wanted nothing to do with America's sanctions world. You look at Brazil, another major country, wanted nothing to do with it. All these countries aren't considered to be part of the world, quote unquote, the legitimate world, which of course is the first world. It's this white power axis that has persisted since the times of Columbus and has slowly deputized places like Japan and South Korea to be part of this white power axis. I mean, it's if we look at polls, we ask anyone around the world, who is the biggest threat to peace? They ask, is it Iran? Is it China? Is it Russia? Is it overwhelmingly the plurality of people on Earth say it's the United States? This was something that really surprised me when I first learned it years ago,
Really?
because yes, because if you pay close attention to U.S. media, you would have no inkling that we are viewed as the great Satan around the world, and with damn good reason. We've done unspeakable atrocities, and we continue to maintain and support
Well,
unspeakable atrocities.
what reshaped your worldview then?
Well, learning that I was considered myself to be a well-educated young man, in high school, NPR, listening, you know, trying to follow current events. But then I
Hmm.
started picking up books that were exceptionally critical of America. And one of the biggest ways in which they criticized America was describing the wars. And, if you're NPR liberal following day to day politics, things like the major wars and their consequences really slip out of the view. You don't read about this Brown University report that shows that 4.5 million people have been killed as a result of America's post 9/11 wars.
Hmm.
4.5 million people. I mean, is there any country in the world with a rap sheet that even approaches that? Absolutely not. How can you we go around saying that we believe in a rules-based international order, well, when we're overthrowing governments, subverting governments, attacking defenseless countries, supporting genocide in Israel, allowing some of the most brutal dictators in the world to get our support? Like, how can we go and say that we're for a rules-based order, that we're democratic? This juxtaposition of the image and reality of America, it ought to be enough for anyone to dramatically alter their worldview, because it's just so dissonant. And I think the rest of the world has understood this because they've largely been the victims of this devastating attack on human dignity. They've largely been on the receiving end of European colonialism, of debt traps, of well, you can go back further, just like outright conquest. I mean, they don't share some of the myths that we have here in America. I think a really good book that covers some of this is recently written by Noam Chomsky and Nathan Robinson, called "The Myth of American Idealism," where they go over this myth and how it's so dissonant with reality. And I think that people who are aware of that are far more likely to look more deeply into something like the Ukraine war and the motives behind it, or look more deeply into what's going on in Taiwan, or look more deeply into Israel, or look more deeply into anything. Just be skeptical about what these government officials are saying. And then you read about the history, that makes you more skeptical of the present, and then you watch these lies being manufactured in real time, well, that has a profound effect on your thinking and your worldview and your understanding about what we're actually up against.
Well, it's fascinating to. I've spoken with Reverend Dr. Don Wagner, who was he's a retired Presbyterian minister who headed one of the most prestigious Presbyterian congregations in the United States, and he was raised as a Christian Zionist, and he
Mm.
evolved into its opposite. And it's interesting to see you and to hear you talk about your journey. Um, and I've seen other people take these similar walks, and it's very interesting because I'm wondering if you think in the I think that some Americans are on that walk too, not all, but some. Certainly, I think we've seen that in the Middle East conflict because the perception of the Israelis and the Palestinians has changed quite a lot
Mm-hmm.
over the past few years. Um, how do you think that that change in perception will can shape America in the future?
Well, for America, the change in perception about, well, Israel specifically, but American intentions writ large, can only have a positive effect. It will allow younger people to be able to be socialized, not to, be subservient to, the foreign policy experts, but to actually question what's going on. That can only be healthy. If young people who are politically minded and who are going to run for something and are going to work in these congressional offices, if they're not default imperialists, or at least they're default empire critical, that can only have positive effects. And I think that around the world, it's going to make it a lot harder for the U.S. to operate the way that it is. And especially when you combine the rise of alternative sources and helpers in development, like, the BRICS bloc. If you're a small country and you see the U.S. coming, offering you debt and loans and stuff like that, you can say no. I've seen how you treat other countries. I've seen what you're supporting in Israel. I see what China is doing, and I think what they're doing is better. More and more countries are going to keep doing that. And as that grows to a fever pitch, more and more countries are going to do business in their own currencies.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so this is a kind of obscure but deeply important aspect of American empire that a lot of people just don't understand because it's complicated, like, economics. But the dollar regime is the basis for your wealth, for my wealth, for all of our privilege here. If we and the way it works is pretty simple. If you're a company and you want to buy something from the United States, or if you're a country, sorry, and want to buy something from the United States, you need dollars. Uh, you need dollars to do it. You have your own country's currency, like let's say it's pesos. You need dollars. Well, I have to sell something that I make with pesos so I can get dollars, so then I can use those dollars to buy something. It's more complicated than that, but those are the basics of it. Well, a lot of countries, since dollars so common, have done their trades in the dollar. And so they just keep needing dollars to make their economy work. What China is doing is it's slowly pushing countries to start using the renminbi, which is the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese currency, to do their transactions. Well, if you don't need as many dollars, then that means the value, the worth of a treasury bond, which is how the U.S. pays for its debt. You issue a bond that's a promise to pay somebody back. That's where our debt comes from. Uh, those become less useful to countries because if you don't need dollars to conduct your trade, then the treasury bond becomes useless to you. Like, why would you buy that? Maybe just because it's a liquid asset, maybe, but you don't need it to do your transactions. That scaled up, on a mass scale, can have profound effects on the American government's ability to spend money and to, you know, finance its anything. This isn't, of course, going to happen overnight, but it's going to be a slow thing as countries start, reducing the number of dollars they have in reserve, reducing the number of transactions that are dollar denominated, increasing the number of countries within this network. Well, that's going to have effects, and that's something that isn't discussed in America. But it will probably be one of the biggest shocks to the American lifestyle, since World War II.
But the tragedy is, Bryce Green, it's happening all over the world. It's happening all around us. It's just not happening with us. Before you go, what would you like for us to know as we look at, because we're going to be inundated with pundits who are going to have their take on this, I mean, on the Trump Zelensky meeting, on the European role. What do you think we should be looking out for? And of course, we cannot separate that from uh, President Trump's meeting with President Putin. I mean, all of this to me, I have to put it into one basket, or should I not?
You should put it in one basket because I think the way that the pundit class of people try and launder the American empire, try and downplay what's actually going on, is by externalizing all the issues. Instead of saying that, instead of describing the situation in Ukraine as a result of the failure of U.S. diplomacy, they couch it exclusively in terms of Russian aggression. Well, that allows you to say that, well, if it's the Russian aggression that's the problem, well, then there's nothing that we can do other than, defend. When in reality, the issues that caused the Russian invasion were caused because of U.S. activities, and that is almost never discussed. So anyone who couches these issues in terms of someone else doing something, you should really dismiss. The same goes for Benjamin Netanyahu, right? Like Netanyahu wouldn't be able to operate if Biden hadn't given him everything he ever wanted, if Trump hadn't continued to give him everything he ever wanted. He would have to stop, just on a mechanical, practical matter. But he didn't, because the U.S. gave him everything he wanted. That is so blaming Netanyahu, saying, "Oh, it's just terrible what they're doing to those kids. I just wish it could stop." It's nonsense. It's utter nonsense because the U.S. could stop it immediately if they wanted to, but they choose not to.
Well, it's going to stop. A wonderful, a brilliant pastor I've known for so long, Reverend Donald Parsons, said this: "Even clouds run out of rain." There are endpoints, everybody, and think about that. How
Even
can we follow
clouds.
you? Even clouds run out of rain. Remember that. Remember that. Remember that. And justice will be served.
Yeah, you can follow me on Substack, Bryce Green's newsletter, and you can follow me on Twitter at the Green BJ. That's where you can find most of my stuff.
And some of the best fights you will see on Twitter, on X. Follow him. He gives. Uh, please, you don't want to take the fight to Bryce because he's ready for everybody. Trust me. Coming
Thank you,
up.
Santita.
Sending you so much love. Let's talk about what's happening in Washington D.C. In Washington D.C., now Black and Brown youth are saying that they are anxious, nervous, even frightened by the military on the streets of Washington D.C. What do you think about that? What is this a harbinger of as President Trump talks about going into Baltimore, sending these troops into Baltimore, into Chicago, into Oakland? Hmm. Let's talk about it in the next hour of the Santita Jackson Show. AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Thank you, Bryce.